Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany, January 31st, 1946. Good evening. This is Sergeant Ted Piers in the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. Last week, Armed Forces Network correspondent Harold Burson submitted a list of 6 questions to Mr. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the Chief United States Prosecutor at the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials. Harold Burson.
At the time, Walter Cronkite was there, Howard K. Smith was there, Dan DeLuce, who had just won a Pulitzer Prize, was there, and there were about 200 correspondents covering the trial, and I was one of them. I was probably the youngest at 24 years old, and to me it was a very awesome experience, and I had a good deal of confidence that I could do the job. I had done a lot of reading on the trial the months that I knew that I was going to be there, and I had a general view of German history up to that time. And I guess the greatest satisfaction I got from the trial was when some of these correspondents who had tuned into my broadcasts would tell me the next day that they thought that I was right on target, or they complimented me on some other aspect of it. Jackson did a good job on part of it, but when it came to historical detail, he just didn't have the history to argue with Goering. And at most, I think the correspondents generally said that it would be about a tie at best for Justice Jackson's performance with Goering himself. And I remember I reflected that view in my own report, and I remember next morning when I was walking into the courthouse, I ran into Tom Dodd, and he said, "You were pretty hard on the boss last night." Let
me tell you how hard you were. It just happened to have. This is March 19th, 1946. This is your words, Harold Burson. Mr. Justice Jackson faced the four-nation tribunal again. I must insist, he pleaded, that the witness answer the questions directly. It is clear, he continued, that Goering had assumed an arrogant and contemptuous attitude which is giving him the type of trial he never gave to any person, living or dead, in Germany. That's what you said. As the eyes of the courtroom refocused from prosecutor to tribunal, Presiding Justice Jeffrey Lawrence announced that court would adjourn, for already it was after 5 o'clock. But, says Harold Burson, but as the day ended with the suspense as of a Pulitzer Prize second act, the talk among newspaper correspondents boiled down to a single comment. Goering so far, they said, has had his own way. It's high time someone stopped him. This has been a report from AFN correspondent Harold Burson. We return you now to the AFN newsroom in Frankfurt.
You know, when I hear that sort of stuff, I wonder if I could write it now.
Harold Burson, you pulled a coup. In January of 1946, you were able to convince Mr. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the Chief United States Prosecutor at the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials, to permit himself to be asked certain questions. And I think at the time it was the only interview that the Chief Prosecutor Jackson permitted. How did that happen? How did you convince him to do that?
It's given me a little bit more credit than I deserve. I knew his chief non-legal assistant, a man named Gordon Dean, who, after he came back from Nuremberg, became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. I got to know Gordon, and I said to him, I'd like to interview Justice Jackson. And he said, well, he has taken the position that he's not going to do any personal interviews as long as the trial is going on. And I said, I think I have a special audience that deserves to hear from him. He said, what do you mean? And I said, you know, I represent at that time there were about 600,000 or 700,000 GIs still in Europe. I said, I think the soldiers deserve to hear from the chief prosecutor what the trial's all about. And Gordon said, I see where you're going, I'll talk to him. And the next day, he saw me in the courtroom, asked me to come up and see him, and he said, you got it. And I gave him the 6 questions, and he answered the questions. It was the only interview that he did during the course of the trial. And he did very, very few really direct interviews on the trial after he left, after the trial was over and he came back to this country. He did not really try to capitalize on his having been the chief prosecutor.
The funniest scene that occurred at Nuremberg, and I just have a note that says Russians drinking story. Can help me out here. Fill in the blank.
The press was lodged. Nuremberg was destroyed, and there was very little housing in Nuremberg for almost anybody. So the press corps was at about 8 miles away from Nuremberg in a little town called Stein. And it was a Schloss, a small castle, that was owned by the Faber of Eberhard Faber, Faber in German, a pencil manufacturer. And one of the living room was dedicated, a large part of it, to a bar. And every night the correspondents would congregate in that bar, and you know, it was, you know, government subsidized, no tax on the whiskey or anything, so you could get, you know, a scotch for 10 or 15 cents. And so the correspondents from, you know, really 8 or 10 different countries, including there were about a half dozen Soviet correspondents there. And there was a man from TASS who was just mesmerized by the different glasses for the different wine and whiskey products, you know, like a shot glass, a Scotch, on the rocks glass, a taller glass, a champagne flute, and so forth and so on, a beer thing. And so he would go into the bar, and he would say, and that meant he wanted one of each. And of course, they had no money. The Russians had no money at all. So what the rest of the correspondents did, Americans, would just put a quarter or 50 cents in a hat and so forth and so on, and let him drink, or let the Russians drink. And so he would go, in the course of about 45 minutes, he would go through maybe 8 or 10 of those glasses. And how he'd always come back very cheerful. Love the Americans at the end of the line. But that's that story.
I'll end this just like you started over here. This has been an exclusive interview. This is with Mr. Justice Robert H. Jackson on leave from the United States Supreme Court as the chief American prosecutor at the war crimes trial in Nuremberg. This has been a report from American Forces Network correspondent Harold Burson. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Burson.